Right. Well, you'll think this is strange because you're seeing the roof of my car, and hopefully that won't matter to you because the information that I provide will be, I guess, interesting enough. So, in my last video, I talked about what could the territories have done to keep Vince McMahon from taking over the pro wrestling world and monopolizing it the way he ended up doing. I remember the early days of the wrestling message boards, like Kayfabe Memories and Wrestling Classics, but especially Kayfabe Memories. I always have a special place in my heart for it because it used to be extremely active. I remember, I think it was in the year 2000 that I first went on those boards, and I was pretty active as Packard Killer 187. And I remember we even had a meetup in LA, in Long Beach, with some old Olympic Auditorium wrestlers, and even who's that guy who wrote that book? Jeff, forgot his name. He was the LA Olympic Auditorium guy that wrote that book about the Olympic, Jeff something or other. Well, I met his son. So we even had a meetup, and there was even talks about another one. It never happened, but the one we did have actually had a real good turnout in Long Beach, and I remember it was really fun. Well, I still go to the message boards once in a great while. They're not nearly as active as they used to be because, I hate to put it this way, but people get older, and a lot of the wrestling fans from the kayfabe era are older now, and, people throughout the years pass away, or maybe, there's only so much wrestling we could reminisce about. But one of the popular topics on the message boards in those days was what could the wrestling promotions have done to stave off the onslaught of Vince McMahon and the WWF. Now, one of the things that was always frustrating on the boards about that topic was that when you proposed a kind of fantasy scenario of how you think things could have gone differently and what various promoters could have done differently to stave off the eventual takeover of the WWF, you always get, well, that wouldn't have worked. It was going to happen anyways. That wouldn't have worked. The promoters didn't know what they were doing. Vince was way ahead of them in terms of vision. Well, we all know that, but that is the whole purpose of speculating, is to speculate. As I take a bite of my breakfast sandwich, excuse me, but I'm going to be eating too on the road here. The whole thing about fantasy booking and speculation is you get to speculate. We know that Vince ended up winning. That's a given fact. So you don't need to shut someone's theory on what could have been different, because and then the whole idea that, well, Vince would have won anyways no matter what they did, that's all speculation too. So we don't know what would have happened, because there were a few times in Vince's national run to prominence where the WWF seemed to be in danger of not making it. So I do believe there is actually things the promoters could have done, if at the very least prolonging the lives of their territories and delaying Vince's takeover. If nothing else, they could have stayed around longer, made more money, and the health of the pro wrestling industry would have been a lot better in the 90s than it ended up being. And when I say the 90s, I'm talking about the first half of the 90s. We know pro wrestling hit a low in terms of talent, popularity, creativity, and then it picked up again from 95 onwards. Started picking up again in 95, and then 96, we know it exploded with the NWO. So I left off kind of last time talking about, Vince buying the territory in 82. And then I would say the official launch of the wrestling war was December 28th, 1983, when Vince took over, the St. Louis Wrestling Club's time slot. I believe KPLR was the station, Wrestling at the Chase. And then, but not only was it that important landmark of taking over what was traditionally the heart of NWA wrestling in St. Louis, but it was pulling Hulk Hogan, Mean Gene Okerlund, and to a lesser extent Dr. D. David Schultz away from the AWA, and them showing up on that program. That was huge. That was the official launch of the wrestling war, even though shots had been fired in the fall of 1983 in the Battle of Ohio between Georgia Championship Wrestling and the WWF. Now, so we're going to kind of go to 1984, because now Vince is kind of going on a mission, territory by territory, he had kind of a twofold system of attack. Go into a territory, buy TV time, and again, the wrestling promoters back then usually were paid to have their show on the air, and in exchange the stations would keep the ad revenue money, and in exchange the promoters would get to promote their house shows, which is, back then in the territory days, house shows were the blood of the wrestling industry. That's how you made money. It wasn't TV, it wasn't even merchandise, it was house shows. TV was merely the avenue in which to promote the house shows, which is where you made your money. So Vince would go into the different territories, and this was a huge risk. This is why I do believe Vince could have been defeated, because he was taking so many huge risks that he was leaving himself financially vulnerable. Well, he would go into a given territory where they already had an established promotion, and he would, instead of them paying Vince would offer them money to broadcast his show. He would pay them. Okay? And that was, unheard of at that time as far as pro wrestling goes. Because you got to remember, pro wrestling promotions, they operated without a lot of overhead. I mean, they had the wrestling rings, and they had, the wrestlers were independent contractors. They might have a couple guys in the office that were full-time employees, depending how big the territory was. And really, their overhead was maybe a small office somewhere in the home city of where their promotion homesteaded, like, the booking office. And that was it. So not a lot of overhead. So wrestling promotions depended on the stations giving them money to air their show. And 9 times out of 10, it was at a local studio, TV studio, they got to use for free. So Vince, if you're a station manager, and your job as a station manager obviously is to produce revenue. If a wrestling promoter is coming and offer you money to have his show on the air, and he's from New York, or it's a New York-based promotion, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep the local guy that you're paying to have his show on the air? Well, obviously, this decision, you can see, would be easy for most station promoter managers. So in some cases, you take over the time, you would get the time slot of the established promotion. They would have to go to a weaker station in some cases. In other cases, he would just go to a rival station of the station that had the other promotion and air a show. Either way, the effects of it were not good for the local promotion. Because even if that local promotion produced a superior product than Vince, which oftentimes they did, because at that time, society was very regionalized. Not like today where it's very homogenized and there's pretty much the same trends, same kind of culture everywhere because of the internet, cable TV, music videos, etc. Back then, there was a certain degree of homogenization. There were certain trends that went nationwide, but areas of the country were very regionalized in their culture. So a lot of the southern promotions did not receive WWF wrestling too well. They thought it was generic and boring because Vince's formula was heavy on squash matches. Now, if you're don't know what that means, squash matches are a match where you put a star against what they call a jobber, enhancement talent, a guy that doesn't really have he doesn't have a name, he's not that well known, he's not that impressive, but his job is just to make the star look good. Now, you do have some jobbers they end up being stars, and they start from the bottom. So not all jobbers are equal. So, but anyways, the job of a jobber is to make the star look good. And the purpose of Vince's doing that, and other promotions did it too, not just Vince, but the WWF was especially known for that, because you could watch an hour WWF TV show and you could see nothing but squash matches the whole show. Rarely would you see a name match between two stars. It was mostly star versus jobber, squash match. And the purpose of that is not to give away too much on TV for free, so that fans feel like they have to go to the arenas. I, as a fan, actually didn't mind that. I didn't mind that formula, because I started watching WWF wrestling in early 1983. That's what I started off with, so that's what I was used to by the time I got to discover in the spring of 1985 AWA, NWA, World Class Wrestling. So that, but a lot of the Southern fans that were used to their shows having, they would have squash matches, but they'd also have name matches too, and they'd have angles. Where in the WWF you would have an angle, but it wasn't as often. Okay? Because Vince, and rightfully so, felt that he had big enough stars that he didn't need to do that too much. Not that the other promotions didn't, but it's just a philosophical difference between WWF and a lot of the other Southern promotions. One, WWF ran shows monthly. Southern promotions ran weekly shows at their towns, so they had to move faster in terms of angles. So, the way it works is this. A lot of the fans did not like the WWF wrestling style. Fans in the South. They didn't take well to it. So, in 1984, things were hit and miss for Vince. He had some wins. For example, Black Saturday. We all know that. Georgia Championship Wrestling, his takeover of that time slot. And even though Vince ended up having to sell that time slot just less than a year later, the damage had been done. He had knocked out a size of one of the NWA's most important promotions, Georgia Championship Wrestling, and they never recovered. Even though they would, due to fan response, come back to TBS just a couple months later, but it wasn't the same. And they ended up being absorbed by Mid-Atlantic Wrestling. Vince pillaged the AWA talent roster, bought TV time in the AWA's territory, and ended up in the second half of 1984 going into AWA cities with AWA talent, and did pretty good. Now, this was, although in 1984, a lot of fans in the South were rejecting Vince McMahon's style of wrestling. What Vince was doing, even though he was losing in a lot of these wars in the South, his promotion wasn't winning a lot of fans, it wasn't drawing a lot of fans to the shows. Nonetheless, what Vince was doing was strategic, because he was watering down the fan base, meaning even if he just pulled a little bit of fans from the local promotion, that was enough to hurt that local promotion's business. And Vince wasn't depending on that area's, for example, let's just say the Mid-Southern territory, which would be, Tennessee, part of, I think, Southern Indiana, Tennessee, and part of Kentucky. Vince wasn't doing good in those areas. He was routinely beat by the Mid-Southern territory. However, Vince didn't depend on that region for his business. Vince had a solid business base in the Northeast, the most populated part of the country. And he had like the biggest cities to draw from in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, and just other big cities, New Haven and etc., New Jersey. Vince could afford to do bad in those territories because the long-range goal was to chip away at the fan base of that local promotion, because that local promotion, that was their base. They weren't drawing money from anywhere else. That was their area. So even if Vince could pull, let's say if he could steal 15% of the way of the fans from that local promotion, the damage is done. Vince, his objective is met. And not only that, but the new fans coming up that otherwise would have only known about Mid-Southern Wrestling are now going to have two options. And to be honest, if you have a child and you watch the Mid-Southern territory, which by the way, it was a great territory, but if you see WWF with kind of more of a glitzy look, more glitzy, more glamour, if you're a little kid, who are you going to choose? So Vince is going after just a fraction of the fan base. That does enough to hurt the local promotion. Even if not a lot, the long-range effect is going to be accumulative. Then not only that, but he's going to get a lot of the new fans that otherwise would have only known Mid-Southern Wrestling. And that's exactly was the plan of Vince McMahon. He didn't have to win and draw more money than the local promotion, because he already had a steady base in the Northeast. And not only that, by this time, he expanded to the West Coast. Now, another big win for Vince in 1984 was his takeover of Toronto, Maple Leaf Wrestling, which by this time was pretty much a mid-Atlantic city. But for some reason, in 1984, Mid-Atlantic, well, that's because they lost a good amount of talent with Greg Valentine and Piper. 1984 Toronto Wrestling, you could look at the crowds, and the attendance was really low for NWA Wrestling. Now, sorry, I'm eating, but finally finished my breakfast sandwich. You don't gotta hear me chew anymore. So, Toronto, Jack Tunney, who we would know as the president of WWF, who's the figurehead president, really, if you think about it, he made a great deal with Vince because he saw the low crowds that he was getting, and he sees Vince kind of making this national move with all these stars that he was plucking from other territories, plus his own stars that he already had. And especially they have Hulk Hogan. And Jack switches allegiances from the NWA to WWF. This was a big win for Vince. And Vince did extremely well in Toronto. Extremely well. Toronto became one of the big main cities for the WWF, and you would see that throughout the years as they drew big crowds at the Exhibition Stadium and later Skydome, and consistent big crowds at the Maple Leaf Gardens. So Vince is just making his mark. He's not doing well in a lot of the southern states, but he doesn't need to. Remember what I was talking about earlier. As long as he chips away slowly and steadily at the local fan base, and then picks up the newer fans that otherwise would have only known those local territories. His money base is the Northeast, West Coast, and now Toronto. And then he's going into AWA with some success. AWA cities. Which obviously hurts them. Now, we're going to start talking about what could the other promoters have done to either stave off Vince's takeover and delay it by a few years, probably is the most reasonable scenario, or altogether defeat Vince and have Vince retreat, or maybe even altogether go out of business, because remember, Vince was taking a lot of financial risk. Now, the first shot at this was actually the Pro Wrestling USA, which was a great idea. The Pro Wrestling USA group was a group that consisted originally of Vern Gagne, Jim Crockett, Bill Watts, Jerry Jarrett of Memphis, and then I also believe there were, I think Eddie Graham was involved from Florida. I think there were a couple other, I think even Ole was involved with Georgia, Ole Anderson. By that time, remember, Georgia had been given the left hook by Vince, but they were still around. And they produced, I believe, 3 shows. They had tapings at the Memphis Mid-South Coliseum, and they featured both AWA, NWA, and just other promotions. Bob Backlund appeared. Great idea. It was a great idea. Now, shortly after these original tapings, Bill Watts dropped out of it, and Pro Wrestling USA ended up, for most intents and purposes, being basically Jim Crockett and Vern Gagne working together, along with Jerry Jarrett, but even that kind of after a few months. I think Jerry Jarrett was only in it for maybe half a year. But the Pro Wrestling USA, I believe, was the best legitimate chance for the territories to stave off Vince, because they could have fostered an exchange of talent amongst each other while respecting each other's boundaries. The problem was, and what ended up ruining the territories and ended up destroying even the NWA, was in order to compete with Vince, they felt they needed to go national. Everybody was trying to go national. I mean, Mid-South, not so much world class, but Mid-South, AWA, NWA with Jim Crockett. Everybody was trying to go national. And that was a big mistake. The best scenario would have been for everybody to stay in their local regions and then do exactly what they were doing at first in late 1984 through 85, was they would then team up together and run these Pro Wrestling USA shows in the Northeast to go against Vince. And they actually did very well for a while. And then just keep their own local territory strong, focus on that. But it's when they all stopped working together, and a lot of them were trying to go national or expand, that things pretty much fell through. And Vince was, they were just basically destroying each other and destroying themselves by trying to expand. We're going to talk about that in another video. However, this Pro Wrestling USA thing got off pretty strong. I think this would have been the best chance. Now, they had great talent. You had Rick Martel, AWA World Champion, Ric Flair, NWA World Champion, and just a lot of great talent. Now, the NWA was fine with Ric Flair. You have a big star in Ric Flair. Now, the Pro Wrestling USA promotion, pretty much for all intents and purposes, as I said earlier, became a Gagne-Crockett co-promotion with a little bit of Jerry Jarrett in there for a few months. But after the first several TV tapings, it pretty much became an AWA production as far as the TV and most of the talent coming from the AWA in terms of, TV show. Hulk Hogan became this all-encompassing babyface for the WWF. He ended up becoming basically the face of pro wrestling. If you think about, Hulk Hogan's obviously well known today. But for newer fans, you have you have to appreciate. See, today a lot of newer fans take it for granted that guys like The Rock, John Cena, they're just, well known and popular. Everybody knows who they are, even non-wrestling fans. But in the 1980s, prior to Vince's national expansion, from December 1983 onwards, prior to Vince's national expansion, most people didn't know. They couldn't name one pro wrestler. It was an underground sport. It was a subculture. So the emergence of Hulk Hogan and the WWF, and Hulk Hogan is this big pro wrestling star, was unique. There was mystique to it. Because again, nobody could name one pro wrestler, most people. Pro wrestling was a subculture. It was far from being mainstream. So Hulk Hogan becoming this big star was unique. It was a huge accomplishment because you got to remember, there's no internet back then. Cable TV is pretty much still in its infancy. Not that many people have it. So it was really a grassroots movement. If the Pro Wrestling USA group was going to have a figurehead babyface star to rival Hulk Hogan, or if they were going to be successful to, as I said, stave off Vince, they were going to have a babyface star. Now, this was the era before the anti-hero. Meaning, it was going to have to be a babyface that led the way. Because what a lot of people don't, today, Ric Flair is far more well-known and popular than he was in his prime. Ric Flair in his prime was either a heel, sometimes he was a babyface, but more often than not, he was a tweener, meaning he worked heel or babyface depending on the opponent and depending on the area of the country he worked in. And he was a big star and a big draw, but he was not an all-encompassing babyface. And in the 1980s, you had to have an all-encompassing babyface if you wanted to really draw big money. Because as big of a draw as Ric Flair was, he was not anywhere close to the level of Hulk Hogan. Okay? Because it was the nature of the beast. He was a tweener or a heel. And in the 1980s, Ric Flair was popular among the hardcore fans, but he wasn't popular among the casual fan. In fact, many people who became Ric Flair fans in the 90s did not like Ric Flair in the 80s because they were used to Hulk Hogan. And so when they went to watch NWA wrestling, they realized the champion was this guy with bleach blonde hair that wasn't that big, and a guy who had like this playboy kind of gimmick. They weren't used to that because in the 1980s it was all about superheroes. It was all about the ultra babyface good guy, the superhero, the clean cut superhero, Superman type of guy. The era of the anti-hero had not happened until the mid-90s. Now, don't get me wrong, you did have anti-hero type of guys. For example, guys like Roddy Piper were popular even as a heel. So there was that. Always there was that. And the Road Warriors is another example in the AWA. But for the most part, for a pro wrestler to gain mainstream popularity, to go above the hardcore fan, he had to be a ultra babyface. He had to be a comic book hero type of guy. And this is what Vern Gagne, specifically, but Pro Wrestling USA collectively would have needed to stave off Hulk Hogan. This type of babyface. And And when you look at the landscape of pro wrestling, those type of wrestlers are always rare, no matter what era you're in. Because it's a once-in-a-lifetime type of wrestler. Hulk Hogan was that type of wrestler. Now, Jimmy Superfly Snuka was that type of wrestler too. But by 1984, notwithstanding the personal issues Jimmy Snuka had, there was also his age. A lot of people don't realize that Snuka was a lot older than he looked. And his personal issues and his age and injuries were catching up to him by 1984. So he wouldn't have been a long-term answer. Now, the AWA actually did try this approach with Sergeant Slaughter. Sergeant Slaughter had a dispute with Vince McMahon apparently over the merchandising of the LGN toys. Apparently there was originally an LGN toy of Sergeant Slaughter, and there were some issues with that. Slaughter walked out of the WWF due to the disagreement with Vince at the peak of his popularity. Slaughter was over huge in the WWF as a babyface after his turn in his big feud with the Iron Sheik. People say he was just as, if not more popular than Hogan. Now, the AWA and Pro USA actually got Sergeant Slaughter in December. It was looked on as a huge coup. It's hard for fans today to appreciate exactly how popular Sergeant Slaughter was in 1940. His popularity rivaled Hulk Hogan's. Okay? Now, the AWA was expecting basically Sergeant Slaughter to be a savior. And they really promoted him big time. Surprisingly and shockingly, when Sergeant Slaughter came to the AWA, he was received tepidly, lukewarm. For some reason, that popularity and the rabid fan support that he had in the WWF didn't translate to the AWA. Now, eventually, Slaughter would become popular in the AWA, but still not near as much as he enjoyed in the WWF. Now, many people say part of that was because of the way the AWA promoted him, but I think a lot of it has to do with demographics. You got to remember, at that time, wrestling was still a very regional sport, and there were regional distinctions and regional sensibilities. You could have one wrestler super popular in one area of the country and not be so popular in another. Or you could have a heel that's hated in one area of the country, and that's good for a heel. That's the equation of a babyface gaining popularity. And then he goes to another part of the country, and the fans are lukewarm on him. There's been several cases of that. So I think it had to do with geographic sensibilities. The AWA fans at that time had a Midwest sensibility, which is they didn't really like the rah type of stuff. Midwest fans at that time liked more of the understated kind of the Crusher, Dick the Bruiser, tough, gruff guys, where Sergeant Slaughter was kind of this rah patriotic type of wrestler. And I think that turned the fans off. And the AWA was trying to force feed him down their throats, whereas Sergeant Slaughter's babyface turn and his resulting popularity was very natural and very organic in the WWF. The AWA was trying to force feed him. So you might ask, well, who would have been a wrestler? Now, I think one possibility, and who was available at that time, was Randy Macho Man Savage. Now, Savage wasn't necessarily the ultra babyface comic book superhero that I was talking about. However, the WWF proved that he could be that type of babyface in his brief babyface run. A little different, a little darker than Hogan, but it still could have worked. He was available. Of course, we know he ended up getting snatched up by the WWF in June of 1985 from Mid-Southern Territory. it could have worked. Now, other possibilities out there, who was available around this time frame, was Ricky Steamboat. Ricky Steamboat was more of a babyface in the Bob Backlund mold in terms of his personality. Okay, he's a great worker, but he's not the type of babyface, as talented as he was, as great of a look as he had, that I believe would have been able to lead a promotion to fight against Vince. He's more of your number 2 babyface. Okay. Now again, Hulk Hogan was very charismatic. Now, your babyface, I think, if you're going to choose a babyface around this time frame, they didn't have to be like Hulk Hogan. Matter of fact, you don't want them to be like Hulk Hogan because it would just come off like you're trying to copy the WWF. Now, another name, I think Savage could have worked, but I even have a better choice, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They're also available as Bruiser Brody, who the AWA actually got, and they brought him in as a heel. Now, Brody could work babyface and heel, but let's just put aside the fact that he would have been unreliable as a full-time lead of your promotion because of his independent nature. Brody's, as a babyface, would have been more of that tough, rough kind of bruiser, Dick the Bruiser crusher type of guy. And I think that would have been limited in terms of what the AWA could do in terms of fighting off Vince nationally. Because again, they're not just going after their hardcore fans, they need the casual fan. I think what the WWF did with Savage, putting him with Elizabeth, would have been brilliant for the AWA to do, but Savage being a babyface. But I have another person in mind, and that would have been Kerry Von Erich. Now, Kerry Von Erich was extremely popular wherever he went at this time. He, of course, was a world-class wrestler, but wherever he went, he was extremely over. All you got to do is watch the crowd reaction at Kaminsky Park in Chicago in 1985. Because world-class TV was penetrating in a lot of places. Vince even wanted to bring them in. World-class was on fire at this time. And I know Fritz was desperate to have Kerry as NWA champion, and he did. Kerry won the NWA title for 3 weeks. But he was desperate to have the NWA belt around Von Erich again, and for probably a longer period of time. But that wasn't going to happen with Jim Crockett gaining control of the NWA, increasingly gaining more power. Now, Kerry was young. He was young, so he had a long shelf life left. Tremendous body. And even though he wasn't the talker Hulk Hogan was, he dripped with charisma. He had kind of the aw shucks, dumb jock type of charisma, which was really popular in the 80s. He didn't need to talk like Hulk Hogan. He was popular with the guys because he had the great body and he had a manliness to him. But he was also popular with the girls. He was like an idol to them. The AWA wasn't desperate at this time of young fans. Sure, they had the long-timers, but they had gained a lot of young fans with Hulk Hogan's arrival in the AWA and his rise to being the top babyface there. And it seemed like they lost a lot of those fans again when he left to WWF. They were basically, the AWA was in need of coolness, credibility. In the 90s and beyond, you talk about street credibility. In the 80s, it was about coolness credibility. There was something in the 80s about the need to be cool. And this was something that AWA was struggling with. World Class had it. And South had it. NWA had it. WWF had it in spades. The AWA had a lot of talent. They had the tradition and the history. Great matches. But they were lacking the coolness factor at this time. Kerry Von Erich would have been the perfect babyface for the AWA to promote at the top and to be their champion. It would have been, now people might say, well, what about Fritz? His obligations were to World Class. Now this is, I believe, how it could have worked. Kerry being AWA champion would have served the purposes of both Verne Gagne and Fritz Von Erich. Fritz was desperate for a Von Erich to hold the NWA World title, and increasingly he was seeing that wasn't going to happen as Crockett was making political power moves in the NWA to keep the title away from the Von Erichs and on to Ric Flair. And for the Mid-Atlantic, which eventually became the World Championship area in April of '85, to be basically equated with the NWA. So, this is what's going on at this time. You have Kerry Von Erich is just super popular. He's at the peak of his popularity in 1985. The AWA is in desperate need of coolness points, coolness credibility. They're still a very healthy promotion, even though they're nowhere near to their 81-83 peak because they lost a lot of top talent, lost Hulk Hogan, and WWE's invading their territories. But 1985 was still a time where the AWA was doing good, and they could have. This was probably 1985 was their last full year of doing good. So if they were going to make any moves to stave off Vince and fight him tooth and nail, this was the year. And this would have worked for World Class and AWA. Why? Because the AWA, they ran about 4 nights a week. They weren't as busy as, say, Crockett and Vince, where those promotions were running every day and sometimes twice a day on the weekends and crisscrossing the country. The AWA had more of a loop in their house show business. World Class, again, they're a smaller territory. There's a few big cities, but pretty much a smaller geographic in terms of, their TV coverage is a lot bigger than their actual house show loop in terms of like geographic coverage. Kerry Von Erich would have been the perfect AWA world champion. Just the fact that he was their champion would have gave the AWA credibility. As far as the coolness factor for fans, would have drew a lot of young fans to the AWA that they desperately needed. Not to mention the female fan base. They would have had a champion that they could hold up in every bit and way match Hulk Hogan in terms of appeal. Fritz would have had his son as AWA world champion. He could have pulled out of the NWA and joined the AWA. And be part of the AWA along with Memphis. And you could have Kerry defend the title in Memphis. You can have him go to World Class and wrestle in the big, split his time between World Class and the AWA. The AWA home base and World Class. AWA could run their same territory, do the Pro USA shows with Kerry as their champion, working with the NWA. Kerry would have been a legitimate world champion. The fans in World Class wouldn't have been turned off as they were when Fritz pulled out of the NWA and they tried to parade the World Class title as a world title, which the fans never bought into. And they could have had a legitimate world champion. And they could have had the AWA World Champion being a world-class wrestler. Both promotions would have gained from the rub. Both fan bases would have been strengthened, especially AWA's would have even increased. And that's how you could have done it. And Fritz could split his time, mostly working AWA, but still working a healthy dose of world-class. Because you don't even need, they could have the big reunion shows in Texas, and the, AWA could have done their big, Metrodome show, Wrestle Rock or whatever. That would have been the best scenario. I think that would have kept the AWA more solvent longer. Now, of course, again, this is one of the frustrating things about the message boards back in those days. But look at Kerry, he was unreliable, the drug, they go into all these things. And I know that. But we're playing speculation, fantasy scenario. Okay, we're saying if things would have lined up right. I think had the AWA done this, they would have been able to fight Vince longer, more successfully. And it would have taken Vince longer to win the war. It also would have kept the wrestling industry healthier longer, to where the first half of the 90s wouldn't have been so devastatingly bad. So, that is what I believe would have been the best scenario for the territories to fight off Vince, because you would have had Pro Wrestling USA still. Vern would have had a marketable champion. They could be the face of his promotion. Fritz would have had a world champion that was his son, and that world championship would have rubbed off positively for the world class, to where they wouldn't have to pull out of the NWA and then try to promote their title as a world title, and that whole fallout. They could have had their legitimate world champion. Vern could have still worked with Jim Crockett in the Northeast, and they would have had Kerry as their world champion. Crockett would have had Flair as his. And of course, the merchandising would have been phenomenal. And just so many possibilities would have arrived from that would have been positive. All right, guys, have a good one. And next time we'll talk about more of the wrestling war of the 80s.